Darran Kern, thanks very much for the video response, and no worries about being butthurt on my end. That's what I'm here for. Interesting, engaging conversation, and as long as nobody's hurling insults at one another, I think it's all good. So no problems there. I tried to make a bit of a response last night, and I don't know if I was just too tired or what. It didn't really work out well. Partially because I'd watched about 5 or 6 minutes of your video and then tried to remember all the points and respond, and it just didn't work so well. So what I've done is I've loaded about the first 5 minutes of your video in here, and I'm going to respond to some of the major points that you make. I'm not trying to take anything out of context, but obviously I'm going to just keep it to the major points that you make for time's sake. And so with that, let's start.
Morality doesn't have an absolute standard. Morality also does not have an absolute source.
Well, obviously I disagree about the standard part, absolute standard. I hypothesize, or I feel like it does. I agree with you on the absolute source part, although these are pretty definitive statements. I mean, these are pretty unequivocal statements. I'm not sure if you substantiate this somewhere, but let's continue.
Morality is ultimately contextual, and most moral judgments, of course, are made after the fact, where we judge something that has already happened and look at all the variables.
I will admit, when I first heard you say this, my immediate sort of knee-jerk response, or reflexive response, was, I hope not. In other words, I don't disagree with you that moral judgments are made after the fact, that we weigh all the situation and we figure out what the morality of an act was. But I would hope that the practical use of morality is to choose behavior, to choose between different behaviors, whether they're acceptable or not in an ethical framework. I think that's the practical application and the most importance of morality. I think even the sort of post-mortem type of judgment that you're talking about, I think is a little bit more geared in some ways towards determining ethics in some instances. But I don't completely disagree with you there, but I would add that I think the importance of morality is to choose correct behavior.
Now, I also highly disagree with both Deconverted Man and Sam Harris's utilitarian idea of morality, because it is short-sighted. Morality is contextual. What is moral for the individual is not necessarily moral for the society, or vice versa.
So it could be me, and it could be you need to expand on this a little bit further for me to grasp exactly what you're talking about here, because I don't see a lot of difference between utilitarianism and what you're talking about. Utilitarianism, I think, would hold that what is moral for the one is not necessarily moral for the group, and what is moral for the group is not necessarily moral for the singular. The greatest good for the greatest number. Deconverted Man expands on that a little bit. It says the least harm for the greatest number as well. And I think you could come to that same formulation using utilitarianism as you've provided. And obviously I have problems with the utilitarian arguments. But anyway, maybe you could expand for me at some point the difference between what you're saying and utilitarianism.
Well, let's say we all like freedom. Freedom is good. We believe that people should be free to do things. This is probably part of why you mentioned oppressive societies, like what Muslims do to women out in the Middle East. So think about it this way. Even here in America, the land of the free, we have a government that tells us a lot of things we can't do. And a large part of the job of the government, especially in terms of certain agencies like law enforcement, is to restrict your freedom. You can't do a lot of things because it's against the law. So if restricting and limiting freedom is oppressive, then the government must be evil, right?
Oh, yes. You took the words right out of my mouth. Now, I'm going to be careful here. That is to say, first of all, I do want to say, you're assuming the automatic validity of the government in assessing an ethical system, and I think you have it backwards. I think you use an ethical system to determine the validity of any institution. We're talking core principles. I'm coming from a position of core first principles. So if you determine ethics to be a certain way, then you can determine the ethics of a particular institution based on that. Now, having said all that, so again, you're assuming the validity of the government in assessing an ethical system. I think that's cart before horse. Additionally, that all depends on the government. If you're talking about the current government of the US, yes, it's evil. Because it is involved in other things that I would deem to be unethical. And again, my opinion, I want to be careful and clear about that. I'm on a quest. I'm not as well read on this stuff as I should be. I'm talking about sort of a bit of a critical philosophy, a critical analysis of the claims of subjective morality and that sort of thing. So I don't know any of this for certain, but if you're talking about the current government, some of the things I deem unethical is theft. And I believe that deficit spending, for instance, is theft. You're stealing not only from people who are not able to consent, but certainly some people who are not even able to consent by the fact that they haven't even been born yet. You can't spend money on other people's behalf without their consent. That's theft. That's stealing from the fruits of their future labor. So I think it is evil, actually. And this is how I come to that conclusion. Now, if you were talking about an ideal government, not necessarily. You're going to say in a moment here that would mean it's evil or unethical to have police departments and CIA. Well, not necessarily, because there's a difference between restricting someone's freedom to do certain things arbitrarily, or taking someone's fruits of their labor arbitrarily because you've decided, based on your subjective moral standards, that it's for the greater good, and restricting people's quote-unquote freedom to initiate violence or theft or rape against other citizens. In other words, if the government is truly acting as a proxy self-defense for people, I don't think that's evil, actually, because any of us could be tasked or just have the right, I think, to do that. If someone's being raped on pardon me, if someone's being raped on the street, it's not the initiation of violence for me to run out there and forcibly remove that person from the other person. And if the government is acting in that capacity, then no. It's not evil. But again, the main point that I want to put forth here is I think you're putting the cart before the horse. You're assuming the automatic validity of government to make your argument, when I think the validity of government should be determined by the ethics of the situation.
But see, that's contextual, because there's such a thing as the greater good.
Well, you say that there's such a thing as a greater good. I'm not sure how you square that with subjectivity. And how you qualify and quantify the greater good. I have yet to see anybody put forth, a pro and con list or whatever for most ethical propositions. Again, you're talking about the government. Look at the U.S. government. I realize it's overinflated and you probably don't agree with most of the programs and policies of the U.S. government, but has anybody actually sat down and determined the greater good aspect of all of those things? This is part of the issue that I have. Besides, I think it's a slippery slope, which I think we're going to get into a little bit here. But additionally, I think it's overly complex to try to determine the greater good of any given moral proposition. And there's going to be all kinds of disagreement and discussion and whatnot. And again, I feel like it's a bit of a slippery slope. I think saying that things are contextual instead of operating on core fundamental principles gives you an opportunity, an avenue to sort of argue for a moral proposition, to try to make a case for something that would otherwise be unethical because it happens to suit your preferences, whoever, right? And so it's similar to something I mentioned the other day in a video. I said that people always say, the government ought to do this and the government should do that, when really they're being a little bit disingenuous. What they really mean is other people should be forced to pay for this because I think it's important. And, they sort of cloak it in that language. And I think it's a bit of a slippery slope, not to mention it's overly complex, rather than identifying things by core principles that you can hopefully determine. I'm talking about a rational determination of these core principles of murder, rape, theft, slavery, the hardcore, major, heavyweight moral issues.
And that's also why I want to object to you reflexively rejecting the idea of subjective morality.
Well, that's just not even fair. As I mentioned in a video that I've uploaded to Deconverted Man and yourself by extension. I don't think I've been reflexive. I haven't knee-jerk responded into rejecting subjective morality. There have been many thought experiments, many a night in the hot tub. I've spent a lot of time introspectively looking at this, talking to people, challenging and being challenged on the subject and doing research and that sort of thing. And I've said in all my videos too that, and I'm not butthurt over this, I'm just pointing this out. I've said in all my videos that I don't know all the answers. I'm not saying I know this for certain. I'm on a quest, etc., etc. So I think, honestly, if anybody's being reflexive here or just making unequivocal statements, it's you. You've said, without qualifying or substantiating it, morality is subjective and it is contextual and it does not have a source and it does not have a standard. Well, that's, I think, remains to be seen. I mean, that's what I'm challenging here, obviously. But I hope, if nothing else, this clarifies for you that I'm not, if I appear to be reflexively jumping to subjectivity, or rejecting subjectivity, I'm not. Anyway.
Morality is subjective, partially because it is contextual. Now, see, biologically, we are empathetic social creatures, so there will always be a root cause of morality in our empathy.
Well, I want to start by saying I agree with you. I think that there is a biological imperative to empathy and that sort of thing. The key word in that was I think. Has anybody discovered the empathy gene? Are we able to switch that on and off? How do we explain the unempathetic if it's a biological imperative? How do we explain, people who are not empathetic and that sort of thing? In other words, all I'm saying is, yeah, you and I both think that unless you can show me some proof or evidence or whatever that it is a biological imperative, I'm not so sure. And the reason I say all of this, because I agree with you, is I'm very, very cautious about labeling things human nature that may be cultural. And so I don't know if it's an actual genetic, again, is there an empathy gene? Or is this something that we have developed over time and it just ends up becoming passed culture through culture and that sort of thing? Because there haven't always been that many empathetic human beings, entire cultures that were not all that empathetic. So I'm not sure that you can make a definitive statement on that, even though I agree with you.
However, that doesn't necessarily make any sense on a societal level.
Why not? I'm not sure I understand how empathy doesn't make sense on a societal level.
Societies have to function on the order of the greater good.
Have to? I'm not sure I understand that. Have to. Where does that come from? Where is the imperative there? And that's not to say as well that the greater good is not served by protecting the good of the individual, right? Why is that not the case? And I understand you're gonna talk about contextual, but in terms of the moral heavyweight issues, I don't think there's any context needed. Again, if we're talking about the alien scenario, killing one to save the entire planet could be considered the greater good. I get that. But that doesn't mean that it is moral, that it is right, that it is good to kill the individual, that the needs of society overweigh that need of that person. I'm not saying you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't make a calculation and just go, you know what? Or as Deconverted Man said, which I think would be probably the most honorable and moral thing to do, would be to say, I'll take his place. I'll do it. Kill me. Whether or not that's acceptable to the aliens, I don't know. And you probably wouldn't persecute or prosecute the guy who did the killing to save the whole planet, because you'd recognize the scenario, but you'd also recognize he wasn't the moral agent in the situation. The killing wasn't moral. It was the least of two horribly immoral acts. He had no choice. And the moral agent in that situation was the alien. It doesn't change the ethics of the situation.
And I wouldn't say the maximum good for the most people, because I think that's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's ludicrous, I think, the way Sam Harris does. And it's impractical. It's extremely impractical to try to imagine that sort of scenario because it doesn't exist.
Well, I kind of agree with you there. I'm not a fan of utilitarian ethics. But I'm not sure how that differs from what you're describing, this whole contextual idea, and you're talking about the greater good, which is very similar, I think, to the utilitarian argument. And again, I think it's just way too complex to then sort out. I mean, in some ways, you only could sort out the details in the aftermath, going upon a system of ethics like that. It seems to me. I think it would be, how much effort would you waste trying to determine before you do something, if it, in all contexts, and how does this work and relate to the greater good over, as I've said before, core fundamental principles.
There is not a moral standard. There's also not a root of morality, because also in the contextual nature of morality is the consequential things. A lot of morality is simply fear of consequences, or a desire to not have consequences.
Well, again, a couple of pretty unequivocal sort of absolute statements about morality that are not really substantiated. I mean, maybe you are saying this in the way that I'm saying it, that that's what you think or believe, but you're making pretty definitive statements there. And fear of consequence and a desire to avoid, them, that's not morality. That's just choice. That's just preference. I mean, I fear some consequences of certain things, but they don't come into the moral realm. I fear not brushing my teeth because I might have bad breath and people might react funny to me or something. There's no moral imperative there. Those things I don't think really fall under that umbrella, the consequentialism stuff. I don't really think so. Again, core principles. It's not to say that I'm rejecting the notion that consequentialism doesn't play a part in whether or not we adhere to certain morals, but it doesn't change the ethics of the act itself. I guess that's the point I'm making.
A lot of us would be perfectly happy, say, pirating music. And it's the societal aspect of, well, we can't have everybody doing that, and a bunch of individuals doing that adds up. But if you think about the individual artist, the individual record label, and the individual taking a copy of that, it's very easy to explain away the individual. But if you look at the society, where everybody's pirating shit and there's losses in the millions from it collectively, it becomes a different issue, because morality is contextual.
We'll finish on this point for this video. And obviously I disagree. I don't think that the pirating of music is wrong because it's contextual, because it in the aggregate it builds up to be something that society can't handle. It's wrong because I think we've determined that theft is unethical. You say people would be perfectly happy to pirate music, but that doesn't make that moral. If only one guy on the planet pirated music, that doesn't mean it's okay for him. It's moral for him because he particularly likes it. That's the problem I have with the idea of subjective morality. If he may view it, he may explain it away, as you say. He may have decided, what, those guys make killing. They are abusive to people. They take too much money. They make too much profit. I'm justified in stealing this because I'm downtrodden, whatever. People will do that. But that doesn't make that any more or less moral than if a whole bunch of people are doing exactly the same thing just because suddenly it reaches a critical mass. The theft is immoral to begin with. And if that guy can't, he may be trying to sort of philosophically explain away how it's moral for him or that it's okay, but I think it'd be a pretty weak argument, and I think it'd be easy for any of us to pick apart. These things, it's not just like if I steal from my neighbor and it doesn't really affect him too much, and it was it affected me a lot, I gained from it a lot, that makes it somehow ethical. If I steal from somebody, I know I'm doing something wrong. I know I'm doing something unethical. And it doesn't change. The ethics of that don't change just because it happens to affect more people. And you could create all kinds of interesting, I think, juxtapositions of that, and then the almost the inverse, the existence of government, as we were talking about before. And if you were to accept, even just on principle for the sake of argument, the notion that taxation is theft, then that creates all kinds of interesting problems there. And again, the complexity of sorting out this contextual thing. So I'll end on this note. What I'm suggesting here, based on my own current understanding of things, my own personal belief, is you have core fundamental principles, and those are unwavering. And then everything else is analyzed through that lens. Because again, I think if you're going to talk about greater good arguments and things changing because of context and society and that sort of thing, you have a slippery slope where you can even make the argument, I think, for some pretty atrocious things. You could make an argument for slavery. You could make an argument that supports rape in certain cases. Given enough, mental gymnastics and context. And that's why I think that's a dangerous, slippery slope to go on. I appreciate the dialogue very, very much, and I'm going to try as like crazy to get to the rest of your video. Thanks, Darren, and thanks everyone for watching.